friends, Heidi here from Rain Country. God is good all the time. And I'm here today to answer a frequently asked question, and that is, do I need to vacuum seal my dried goods? Well, the answer is going to depend on what the dried goods are, and that's all going to vary. But there's a good many things that you really do not need to vacuum seal, but it's still important to try to get as much air out of your jar, your bag, or whatever it is you're storing it in as possible. And that could simply be by making sure that whatever you're storing in the jar, that the jar is very full. And if you start working through that jar, then at least when you get down to a certain point and you can put it in a smaller jar, then put it in a smaller jar, and then making sure you have a good tight lid. And if it's a canning jar lid like this, you want to make sure you're tightening the band down pretty good each time. And for a lot of things, that will be good enough. I personally vacuum seal everything, but I've had some things through the years that have lost their seal. And the good thing about that is that it has allowed me to be able to do comparisons between items of the same kind that stayed vacuum sealed and those that didn't. So I'll be talking about some of those items. Now, I know part of the reason this question keeps coming in is that some people either just do not want to invest in something like the Food Saver tops and a brake bleeder, or a Food Saver machine, or any other kind of pump, or even the vacuum chamber, or maybe they just don't want to build their own. Maybe they don't want to mess with it. Maybe they just don't have the money. I understand these questions. Of course, there are a lot of people that say, well, I don't even have glass jars, so can I use Ziploc bags? Well, even though I'm one that's trying to get away from plastic as much as possible, sometimes we just got to do what we got to do. And if Ziploc bags are what you have, yes, you can use them. And some are made for vacuum sealing and some are not. Those ones made for vacuum sealing can be pretty expensive, and since Ziploc bags don't really have a long life, they sometimes are only good for one use. Sometimes they're good for more depending on how they're used. But you can still take a Ziploc bag and get a lot of air out of it without having to use any kind of pump whatsoever. And I did a video years ago where I showed how to do that with a Mylar bag. It was a Ziploc Mylar bag is what it was. And it's something as simple as just either filling your sink full of water or a big enough pan or bowl that you take your Ziploc, you zip it up most of the way, and then you just start slowly immersing that item, whatever it is, into the water from the bottom up, of course, and never letting water get inside. You got that corner, you keep it up there, and then when you get to where the water is just below that corner and it's pushed out all that air, then finish zipping it up. And that's going to take out most of the air in that bag. And so that's one way to do it. Even though a lot of things can do well without having to vacuum seal or even remove all the oxygen, and a lot of that stuff won't even spoil if it's just exposed to air. It's just that keeping as much air out of the jar or bag, whatever it is, as possible is going to help preserve the freshness of the various things. Now let me break it down by item. So let's talk about meats, for instance. I personally recommend always vacuum sealing meats. Now those people who say, oh, you should never vacuum seal any kind of fat. Well, I don't agree with that. I mean, people talk about the botulism thing, and I just don't think in this case it is a concern. In fact, I went to I think it was Colorado University website in the section where they were talking about preserving dried foods, and they didn't talk about vacuum sealing. They actually recommend storing in Ziploc bags when you dry meats of any kind, be it jerky or like what I have here. They still recommend getting as much air out of the bag or whatever it is as possible to prevent rancidity of the meat. So in that case, I would say whether there's a lot of fat in there or not, yes, I still recommend vacuum sealing it. But the Native Americans dried their meats all the time. They stored them in fats, and they didn't vacuum seal all this stuff. So it's very likely you can still get a very long life without having to vacuum seal it. But I would still do it because I have the ability to do it. Herbs, generally speaking, can do very well in jars like this, or even in bags if they're fully dried, without having to vacuum seal at all. In fact, I've had herbs where I pulled out a jar of oregano that had come unsealed somewhere during the time, and it had been sitting in there for years, and then a jar of oregano that I believe was still vacuum sealed but was also very fresh, and I pulled them out and I opened up the one that was newer and had stayed vacuum sealed and compared the aroma and flavor, and found there to be very little difference, even though the unsealed jar had sat back there for at least a couple of years like that. So generally speaking, herbs can do very good without having to be vacuum sealed between uses. However, it's still my preference to always vacuum seal anything I'm putting back there for storage. But I always have items here, whether it be herbs or some of these other items I'm going to talk about, that I just work through them. I don't vacuum seal in between every use. I just work through them. Another example would be something like right here. I have a jar of dehydrated snow peas. Snow peas dehydrate up beautifully without blanching, by the way, and they can stay pretty crunchy for a long time. Well, this jar, they're from the same year. This jar is vacuum sealed. This jar is not. Now, it's possible the slight difference in sound could simply be the type of jar and the amount that's in there, but when I open this up, this unsealed one, these are still very crunchy. Look at that. Not sealed. It's been sitting back there. It might have been, not that it came unsealed, but it might have been one I was starting to work through. Usually when I start to work through a jar, I just don't bother sealing it up when it comes to herbs and vegetables. I do the same thing with the zucchini. In fact, I have a zucchini jar here from, I think, a couple years ago that I'm working through. And as I'm working through it, I don't vacuum seal it between each one, and I've never had issues with it going stale. On the other hand, I have had peanut butter powder stored up in jars for quite a number of years, like 5 years. And not too long ago, and I did a video on the peanut butter powder, and I think I talked about it in there, and I'll link to that video down below. I had pulled out the two different jars, one that was vacuum sealed and one that had come unsealed, and I found that the jar that had come unsealed, the top layer of peanut butter powder had a rancid smell and flavor to it. So I just took that, I just scooped all that top layer off and threw it away. The rest of the powder was fine. The jars that stayed sealed, when I checked them, totally fine. No rancid smell, no rancid flavor. So certain things are best, and think about this, peanut butter powder, even though a lot of the fat's been removed, it still has fat in it. And the one that was not vacuum sealed was the one that was starting to turn rancid. But in the case of vegetables, I think as long as your vegetables are mostly dry, and now I'm talking about dehydrated, not freeze-dried in this particular case. Most dehydrated vegetables and herbs will do just fine. But now when you switch over to freeze-dried, there's a big difference. So if you have your own freeze dryer and you're storing things in jars, yes, you should vacuum seal it every time. Or if you're storing it in Mylar, you need to get as much of that air out as possible. Or if you're buying freeze-dried foods, especially number 10 cans, and you open that can, you should divide it up into jars and vacuum seal it right away, because freeze-dried foods, and here's an example here. Here's some strawberries I had bought, and you can see I'd started working through them, but I didn't vacuum seal the jar after the last time I used them, and I haven't used them in a while. Now the top ones, they still will break, but I can tell a difference. There's a little bit of softness there, but here's the thing I really want to show you, is look at that. See what happens is if you do not vacuum seal, moisture can sometimes still get in your jars and cause this to happen, and you can have your freeze-dried foods or certain dehydrated powders even that will turn to a brick in your jar if you do not vacuum seal between uses. Clearly, I either thought I was going to work through this faster, or I simply forgot to vacuum seal it again. Now, when you're talking about things like crackers or cereals, if you're storing those in jars, yes, you should vacuum seal it. Anything you start to work through, if you put it away half full and forget about it, and you didn't reseal it, those things will go stale in time, no matter how tightly you put on the lid. So these here are vacuum sealed, and I do like to put the bands on anything that I have dried, even though I didn't, for some reason, on this, put the band back on it. This is the beef here, the ground beef. So on the freeze-dried, that's any freeze-dried. That doesn't matter what it is, whether it be cheese or vegetables or fruit, you need to have it well sealed and vacuum sealed somehow, you're going to keep your fruits and vegetables a lot more fresh and crisp that way. I've had stuff like this where I forgot about it, and I was working through it and then forgot about it, and it went really soft, kind of stale. The flavor was still good. I still used them up. They weren't spoiled. You can see here I have some nuts vacuum sealed in jars. I don't believe vacuum sealing nuts in jars is important. I still prefer to do it. And again, I'm not worried about botulism in this case. Same thing with chocolate chips. These I've had vacuum sealed in here since 2014, and they are still good. It's probably not necessary with chocolate chips either, especially because of their high sugar and fat content. I still like to vacuum seal. Now, the popcorn really doesn't need anything special for preservation. I never vacuum seal popcorn in anything. The only reason this is in a jar is this is the jar that stays in here, and we just fill it up when we need to, and it just has a regular lid on it, not vacuum sealed. I happen to just filled it up yesterday. So once we get to the bottom, I go back to the bucket I keep it in, a bucket that's not any kind of special seal. There's a Mylar bag in there, but I don't even seal the Mylar bag in between uses. I just put the lid back on the bucket. Popcorn is one of those things that has an indefinite shelf life. You can just throw it in a bag somewhere. As long as it's not getting a lot of moisture exposure, it's going to be fine. They found popcorn that was in a tomb in Egypt that was at least 8,000 years old, and the popcorn still popped. So there you go. And the same really applies to grains. A lot of people like to vacuum seal grains. The main thing about grains is making sure you get as much of the air out as possible, and then seal it well, because you don't want oxygen getting in there, because if you get weevils in there and there's a nice free flow in oxygen and they can breathe, it's not going to suffocate them. That's the reason a lot of people vacuum seal, but grains can do very good without vacuum sealing. Long before I got real serious about getting into the buckets and the Mylar bags and the oxygen absorbers, which I never got real serious about oxygen absorbers, because generally speaking, I think they're a waste of money. But that's an option too. If you don't have a vacuum sealer, you can just keep buying oxygen absorbers that are only good for one use and throw them in there to remove the oxygen, be it in a bag or a jar. But at any rate, before I did all that, I wasn't storing my flours and my grains in anything special. And I never had any issues with weevils. None whatsoever. No oxygen absorbers, no special seal. We didn't have the gamma lids. We didn't have anything like that. We just got these big buckets that Patrick was able to get from work back then that, they were just going to throw out, and that's what I did, and all my stuff stayed good. Like I said, I don't even mess with the oxygen absorbers. I did do a few buckets like that, but for the most part, I just found them to be a waste of money, because as long as I push all the air out of my Mylar bags when I put the grains in there for long-term storage, then zip it up or use the hot iron and seal it up well, make sure there's no air, and then put a good tight lid on there. That's the stuff that goes into long-term storage, the stuff that I'm working through right away. I still use a Mylar bag just to keep it in there, because it's either going to be exposed to the Mylar or the plastic. And I put the grains in there, I throw a few bay leaves in, and I just work through it that way. I don't seal anything up. I don't even seal the bags up, just put the lid on out between each use. The one thing that for certain, and I kind of touched on this with the freeze-dried, is that when you're talking about certain powders, like, your apple powder, or especially, I don't have any out here because now when I dehydrate my tomatoes, I never powder them. I just flake them. They're going to take up a little bit more room in your jars or bags than a powder will, but I don't have to worry about this turning to a brick when I start to work through it. Tomato powder is the worst. If you powder it up and then store it in a jar, you need to vacuum seal it. You must, even between each use, or at least store them in smaller jars, depending on how fast you're going to work through it. Because if you leave it for pretty much any length of time, the tomato powder will turn into a brick. It doesn't spoil, but it will turn solid in there, and it's near impossible to get out. And then you will have wasted it. It's not bad in any way, but it's still going to be a waste if you can't get it out without breaking the jar. So if you're going to powder up your tomatoes, even your zucchini, if you powder it up, does a little bit better than some powders. but I still recommend vacuum sealing between uses because it can still start to solidify. Nothing like the way tomato powder does, but a lot of it too, again, comes back to how much is in your jar. So once you start working through a jar and you've got all this air exposure in here, let's say like this. Now these are fine because I'm working through them fast enough, and zucchini is one of those that I don't, it just isn't an issue. But if this was something like tomato powder or freeze-dried, especially freeze-dried goods, these would turn very stale with all this air in here. So you'd want to make sure that you, especially if you're not going to work through it fast enough, you downsize these into smaller containers. And if you're putting them in bags, then the nice thing about bags is that you don't have to keep transferring to smaller containers. You can just push out more of the air, fold the bag down tighter, and then zip it up if that's the way you're going to do it. That's just not my preferred choice when it comes to putting up dried goods. But though I do prefer jars, I do understand the issue with being able to get jars, like the real canning jars, the real American made ones, or whatever ones that are made well in other countries, and not end up with the cheap Chinese jars that are just falling apart and breaking at the littlest thing. I understand these are getting harder to get and that they're getting more expensive. I've just been blessed that through the years, every time we come across a garage sale that had them for, 25 cents a jar or a whole box of them for a few dollars, I was buying them up. And I've had people that, neighbors that were giving away jars and they didn't want to can anymore, grabbed those up for free. I had friends give me jars. I've had family members that quit canning that gave me jars. So I have a lot of jars because of that. That's been years worth of stocking up on jars. I've bought a lot new too, but I would say at least half of the jars I have were all ones I found used. But I know a lot of people are getting new into this and they're like, what do? I can't get any decent jars, because you have to be very careful. Now, it's not even that they're just making these cheap jars overseas and making them appear to look like ball jars by the packaging looking similar. They're now labeling them as ball jars when they're not, or ball lids when they're not. I've been hearing a lot of stories about this. So it's like, where do you get them? I would just be very careful about ordering any jars online at all, from anywhere. If you can find them locally or find them used, that's going to be your best bet. If you can't, then you can always recycle jars like I did here. So if you're buying green olives, or if you're one to buy spaghetti sauce or any kind of sauces in jars, recycle those jars. Those are great for storing dried goods in. Just putting that lid on nice and tight. And in most cases you can do that and it will be fine. I do vacuum seal up my vanilla beans that I stock up on, because I don't want them to turn hard. I want them to stay soft and pliable. Here's some green beans I was working through from 2018, and though they're still pretty dry and I can still break them, there's definitely a difference between these and the snow peas. So these didn't hold as well, but then again, look at how much airspace is in this jar. I keep forgetting I have these. They've been sitting back there for a couple of years unused. These are from 2018. But I think I haven't used them in at least 2 years. So I should leave this out so I remember to add them to my next soup, which is going to be, I think, tomorrow I'm making soup. So I'll be adding those in there to get them used up. By the way, I'll link to this set down below. Right now, the best price is on Amazon, but you can also get them on Food Saver. And I like to use the brake bleeder. I have a lot of videos showing how I use that. I'll put one of those down below, as well as showing you how I use the vacuum chamber if you're interested in any of that stuff. But if you can't afford it, there are still ways to make it work, to be able to try to get your foods as airtight as possible, so you're keeping your quality in your foods for as long as possible. And if you're able to do it, if you have a lot of jars, then this is the method I do recommend most for most of the stuff. But grains and all that, just store them in buckets. I would never put them in jars just because it would use up a ton of my jars for the kind of grains that I put up. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video and you found it helpful. And anyone out there that has any more suggestions or just experience they want to share, please do that in comments down below, because we have tons of new people always coming in, always wanting to learn something new. If you got any questions, ask them down below. I will either answer the best I know how, or we have a great community of people that will like to read through your questions and help answer those as well. We all have something that we can share with each other to help us do better at putting away food for long term to get us through those hard times. All right, well, thanks for watching. Take care and God bless.